Okay, so the Americans, the I guess you could say oppression, depredations continue. Americans decide to call another Continental Congress. This one's called the Second Continental Congress, and they come together to really try to organize a response to the British. And the again, they divide into two different camps. Okay, on the one hand, the first argument is going to be, how are we going to respond? Are we going to build an army? We're going to have a national army, or are we going to just have the militias, right? And the argument of the one group has looked at what happened in Boston, and one of the things that happened in Boston was that the British were defeated and they abandoned Boston after the Battle of Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, right? Okay, so some people are saying, well, we don't even need an army. We just need to use our militias. And there's always been this real reluctance to allow a standing army. I should say always, up until World War II, actually, but there's always been this reluctance to allow a standing army. They don't want to have a central government that has a powerful army that can infringe upon your rights. Okay, so there was a real argument here, but the decision was made that they would try to create a continental army, and then they needed to have a commander, and they picked George Washington. Okay, now let's think about, well, why did they pick George Washington? He had some military experience. You guys will remember that he was in the Virginia militia, although he had quit the Virginia militia because they wouldn't give him a commission, the British. The other thing about Washington that was important was that he was from Virginia. Why would it be important that Washington was from Virginia? Let's think about now, who was really pushing for Washington? John Adams. Does anybody remember where John Adams was from?
Massachusetts,
okay. And it's one of the biggest colonies, right? The other biggest colony is what? Which one do you think? Virginia. Okay. So now let's think about it. If you're on the playground, right, and you're being bullied, who do you want to be on your side? The biggest guy on the playground, right? And who's the biggest guy on the playground here? Is Virginia, right? So if you can get a Virginian to lead your army, that's more than likely going to get Virginia on your side, right? And that's why Washington was picked. It was actually a political decision to pick Washington so that they could bring the Virginians along with them. All right. Well, then we go back into our different groups: the radicals and the conservatives. The radicals include John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and they're pushing for a Declaration of Independence. The conservatives are going to be a guy named John Dickinson, right, who was a farmer. He wrote a book called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, and he wanted to make up. He wanted the to somehow reconcile with the British. Okay, so on the one hand, we have people pushing for independence. On the other hand, we have this idea that we should somehow make up. The public opinion at this time was probably pretty much against declaring independence. This was something that was really unthinkable. The idea that you would be able to declare independence, right? It's kind of like when if we decided that San Diego was going to declare independence from California, right? I mean, who would even think of that was a good idea? You know what I'm saying? And that's the way people thought of it. You just can't do that, right? But what happens is that there's a pamphleteer. There's a kind of a misfit, I guess you could say. His name was Thomas Paine. He'd had a lot of trouble in England, and he finally emigrated to America with letters from Benjamin Franklin, who was in England at the time. And he came to America. So he's very anti-monarchy, right? And he's going to write a little pamphlet called Common Sense. And what the pamphlet says is that Americans need to look past what they think of as common sense now, because common sense at that time was that they would continue to have a monarchy, right? And he said that if we look at all these things that we're being oppressed by, and we look at all the resources that we have, there's no reason why we should be ruled by Britain. And this is going to become a very popular pamphlet because it really states what many people have already started thinking, that being part of the empire really isn't that great of an idea, and that we should be independent, right? And so what we see then is this shift in public opinion towards independence, and because of that, the Congress will actually write and publish a Declaration of Independence, right? So that's going to be how the Declaration of Independence actually happened. Okay, well, the next thing is that there's going to be essentially 8 years of war, or 7 or 8 years of war, which is going to be mostly bad news for the Americans. The Americans barely survive, but in the end, they will win. Okay, they will win independence, and this is why. Basically, these three big reasons, and again, obviously, this is really oversimplification, but the three big reasons are that first off, George Washington didn't lose. Okay, what that means is that George Washington was not a he was not a conventional general, right? Because a conventional general, the way that it worked was the way that war was supposed to work at that time was that the they would have a battle, and whoever lost the battle would surrender. Okay, but Washington would have a battle, and he would lose the battle, but he didn't surrender. Instead, he left. He ran away. Right? Okay, and then he would come back and fight again another day. So that broke the rules, but it also meant that Americans didn't lose the war. Okay, and even later, when the British were able to take Philadelphia, which is the American capital at the time, the idea was that if you take the enemy's capital, then you win, right? That was, capture the flag, right? But when the American government just left, okay, and so the British didn't win. They couldn't win, okay, because the Americans wouldn't give up, okay. So that's the first part. The second part is the French alliance. The Americans sought an alliance with France, and eventually successful in gaining that alliance, not on the part of the French, because the French were in favor of America's ideas of liberty and that sort of thing. But if you'll recall, the French were still very upset from the loss in the French and Indian War. So what happens then is when France allies with the Americans, then all of a sudden for Britain, it's no longer just a colonial war. Now they have to fight the war all over the world, because the French and the British are going to be fighting in Europe and in America and in the Caribbean and in Asia and South America, right? And in fact, the last battle of the American Revolution was fought in India, right? Okay, so then what happens is that this little skirmish that was happening this little disturbance that was happening among the colonists in America is now a global war, which is costing the British a lot of money, right? And blood, okay? And then finally, with the loss at Yorktown, the British the British had already lost one army at Saratoga, and that had actually caused the French alliance to come into play. They lost another army under Cornwallis at Yorktown, and that will bring down the government, and the public will demand essentially that the British come make peace with the Americans, right? So the British then decide to negotiate with the Americans. This happened in 1786, I think, but they argued in Paris over the treaty for a couple of years. Okay, so at any rate, the British then make peace with the Americans based on the fact that the British public was no longer would no longer support the war. Okay, now this you may be wondering, what is this painting? This was actually what happened at the time. Was whenever there was a major treaty, right, that all the people who were involved in the treaty would come together for a portrait. Okay, but the British were so upset they were so embarrassed at having lost the war to these American colonials that they didn't show up for the portrait. So the only people that ended up in the portrait were the Americans. Okay, and this is a real portrait. It's actually hanging in John Adams' house in Massachusetts now. All right, and that's how the Americans won the war. Now, let me just ask you this question. Just knowing what you know about history, can you think of any other example of when a tiny country that was militarily deficient was able to defeat a mighty country because the people of the mighty country just gave up on the war, would no longer support it? Can you think of an example like that?
Vietnam.
Exactly. That's exactly what happened in Vietnam. So, all right. So the Vietnamese learned from American history, even if Americans didn't. Okay.